Hello, I'm Crackshot. Welcome to another episode of Crackshot Chronicles. Today I'd like to discuss terminal ballistics, what bullets do to bodies. Now, everyone who has a firearm for defensive purposes know that when they take a gun, they point it at a bad guy trying to harm them, they pull the trigger, gun goes bang, bullet hits the bad guy. But what happens once the bullet leaves the gun and strikes the person? All the sequences of events that happen once that bullet makes contact with that person is called terminal ballistics, because it is the last thing that the bullet does before it comes to a complete full stop. Now there's two other types of ballistics. There are internal ballistics, which is what happens to the bullet when you pull the trigger while it's still inside the gun. Then there are external ballistics, which is what happens to the bullet after it leaves the barrel of your gun, but before it reaches its target. We're not going to discuss internal ballistics or external ballistics. We're going to talk about internal ballistics, because today we're going to learn what actually happens to the target when your bullet hits them. Now, I went ahead and made a small little demonstration using a loaf of bread. Now, I know a loaf of bread is nowhere near living tissue, but when you drive something through a living tissue, or you drive something through a piece of cardboard, a piece of wood, a human body, or an animal, the same thing happens. A solid object is being pushed through something, and something has to get out of the way. So it gives you a pretty good demonstration of what it's going to happen. Let's go ahead and pause so that we can go to that film that I made so that we can discuss it. Have you ever wondered what happens when a bullet goes through a body? Well, let's pretend this is a bullet. Let's pretend that's a body. Now, when a bullet initially enters a body, let's say right here, and it starts pushing through, now it does this at high speed. It pushes through and usually makes a little puncture. As it pushes all the way through on the other side, all that meat, all that's in front of that bullet, is being pushed back with the projectile, by the projectile. And on the other side, if it keeps going through, at some point what's going to happen is the bullet is going to exit. Now when it exits, you can see how immediately this loaf of bread starts swelling. Just like that, before the bullet finally pops out and a big chunk. Now, just to show you, this is the bullet hole. As the bullet goes all the way through, let's go ahead and pull the bullet all the way through. Now, as the bullet enters the loaf of bread, it makes a very small hole on this side. Okay? But as it goes through, it pushes out all the insides. As you can see how the bread is showing all its guts basically sticking out the backside, all gets blown out. And if you notice, the entry hole is always the same size as the bullet. But the exit hole is usually several times larger than the bullet. Now, as you can see daylight right through it. So, what does this tell us about wound ballistics? Even though this is not a body but a piece of bread, and even though this is not a bullet but a piece of stick, it still demonstrates how physics applies when a bullet goes in and it pushes all that bone and that tissue through, and each one of those pieces of matter will come out the other side when it exits, always leaving a much larger hole on the back side than it does on the entrance. Same thing happens when you shoot a deer or squirrel or a criminal trying to kill you. So if anyone ever tells you that a small caliber bullet is not going to doesn't do anything but punch holes, remember this piece of bread. Now, it is not a living tissue, but living tissue will do basically the same thing. Perhaps even more, because the bones will become projectiles moving at high velocity, as the bullet passes through the body at high velocity. Okay, so we're back. Now, I realize that that piece of bread being punched by a stick is not exactly what's going to happen in a defensive shooting when your bullet strikes the bad guy. But it's very close to what's going to happen. The bread is not elastic, so as the meat of that bread is pushed through, it's going to expand. It's going to take larger and larger chunks. Whereas living tissue is very elastic. And when a bullet enters the body, it doesn't merely just punch a hole straight through and through. As it enters the body, the energy dump hitting it creates a hydrostatic shock wave. And that shock wave expands the tissue. It makes a big, kind of like a temporary wound cavity. That temporary wound cavity is many times larger than the size of the projectile as it's going through. So that temporary wound cavity, let's say the projectile is as big as my index fingernail. The temporary wound cavity may be the area where my hands are showing. Well, all the tissue in that area as that bullet is passing through is being disrupted. So it's being, there's capillaries going to be broken, it's going to be bleeding, it's going to be bruising, and all that trauma is used to shut down that individual. Now, once the bullet exits, that temporary wound cavity doesn't stay open. It closes up because skin is very elastic. Now, all this happens, at high speed. Basically, at the speed the bullet's traveling through. A bullet that's traveling at extremely high speeds creates a much larger temporary wound cavity than a bullet that's traveling at slow speeds of the same diameter. So you can either opt for a larger projectile to create that large wound cavity, or you can use a faster projectile to create that larger wound cavity. Remember, there's two wound channels. One is called permanent wound channel, which is the exact same size of the bullet as it enters and grows as the bullet expands if it happens to be a hollow point projectile. And then there is the temporary wound cavity, which expands as the bullet creates the hydrostatic shock. Once the bullet exits, it collapses on itself. The one that's most deadly is the permanent wound channel. The temporary wound channel aids in trauma, but the permanent wound channel is the one that's actually removing tissue. And any bone fragments that bullet hits becomes a projectile which creates its own wound channels. So, in a nutshell, there's two types of people, ballisticians. The one that feel that the bullet that goes through and through is more dangerous, and then there's the ones that feel that the bullet that goes part way through and stops inside the body is the more dangerous one to the person being shot. The premise is a bullet that goes in and stops after it reaches the vital organs dumps 100% of its energy into that target, thus creating the most amount of damage. And there's some logic to that. The other side of that coin is bullet that goes through and through does not dump all of its percent, only a small percentage of it. It keeps going past the target. So they seem to think, some people seem to think that because it went through and through, it's not as damaging to the body. But fact is that if you remember the piece of bread, the bullet went through and through, the imaginary bullet went through and through and left a big gaping hole in the backside. Now, if you were shot by a bullet, would you rather be shot by a bullet that entered you and stopped and has you bleeding only on the entrance wound? Or do you want a bullet that goes through and through and has you bleeding from the front and from the back? I'd rather get shot by one that stays inside me. Ideally, I'd rather get shot by neither. But that is what terminal ballistics is all about. Terminal ballistics has turned into a big science, and there's a lot of debates on both sides of the equation. There's debates whether a small, fast bullet is more lethal or whether a slow, fat bullet is more lethal. Both of them get the job done because both of them perform the same task from different approaches. A large caliber bullet usually makes more tissue destruction because it leaves a larger permanent wound cavity. A small caliber bullet can do more tissue destruction because it's moving at such a faster speed that the neighboring tissue is disrupted. It can also fragment, which will cause more trauma, or it can expand. Slow bullet projectiles tend to not expand. So if you're using a small bullet projectile, a small caliber projectile, you're relying on the size primarily to do your damage. If you're going with a small caliber projectile, you're relying on the speed primarily to do the damage. Either event, both of them will be pretty hard on the host, the person getting shot. There's a lot of information on the internet that you could pursue and research about terminal ballistics, but I feel that anybody who carries a firearm for personal protection should have at least a basic understanding of what terminal ballistic is and what a bullet does to a body when you shoot it. The same thing happens to animals when you go deer hunting or squirrel hunting or defensive shooting. If you like this video, please subscribe so you can get more like it. Also, please comment. All your comments, good or bad, are appreciated. And don't forget to share. Please share this and like it. Thank you so very much for watching. Have a great day.